I've recently been reflecting on my time with the Crowsworn backer demos. I supported the Kickstarter for the game at a level that gave me access to the 2 demos they've released in the last 4 years, and which also gave me the shirt that I'm now wearing. I most certainly did not play those demos in a timely fashion, but I did eventually get to each of them in turn. In fact, Let's Plays of both demos can be found on my channel right now. I don't suggest you watch the first one, but I do recommend you watch the second one. That one I think is pretty good. The first demo was a simple boss demo. You load it up, you cross the wide bridge, you fight the boss, easy enough. But the second demo is a full game demo, sort of. It's not technically a slice of the entire game, but rather its own dedicated vertical slice, a mini game, if I may so call it. These demos are solid. They give a good idea of what we can expect from the full release, hopefully within a year or so, but they aren't perfect. There was, in my experience, definitely some occasional jank, but that doesn't keep me from being excited about the game. To get it out of the way at the start, yes, it is clear that Crowsworn takes a lot of inspiration from Hollow Knight and similar Metroidvanias. To that I ask, why is that a bad thing? I mean, Hollow Knight is one of the greatest games of the century, and definitely has a foot in the door of the best games of all time discussion. Though I don't have as much inherent connection to Hollow Knight as many others do, I acknowledge its brilliance. I've even gotten to 106% completion in it. For whatever reason, I ended up stalling at Troop Master Grimm. Yes, the standard version, not even the Nightmare King variant, much to my shame. Beyond the 106% run, I've done a number of other partial playthroughs of it. Hollow Nest is such an engaging and enjoyable setting, Hollow Knight's combat is great, and it is a wonderful execution of the Metroidvania side of gaming, a genre that I have little experience with, and even less skill in. Anyway, the point is that Hollow Knight is great, and we all know Crowsworn has some relatively heavy gameplay and visual inspiration based on it. There are even arguments all over the place online as to whether folk think that Crowsworn or Silksong will release first. Side note, I myself find the argument pretty uncharitable, particularly when people complain about Crowsworn's estimated release being in December 2023. Does nobody remember that Hollow Knight was several years delayed as well? Let the devs spend the time they feel is necessary on the game. It's not like they're silent about progress, unlike Team Cherry, but even there it's just beating a dead horse. Despite the surface level similarities to Hollow Knight, however, I feel like Crowsworn has already made a very different impression on me, tonally. Though there are some similar background ideas going on, the general visual style, color palette, design philosophy, etc. strike me as thoroughly different. Different in a way that I'm really interested in. After all, that is why I backed the game in the first place. But before we explore more of the conceptual underpinnings of Firandal, let us discuss what the first backer demo offered in the form of the boss demo. A boss demo makes for a great introduction to the tone, style, and controls of a new game. You get to see a functional piece of the inherent functionality of the game, and that's always encouraging. That said, there were definitely some hiccups I felt I encountered while playing the demo. Bear in mind, it's been a couple of years at this point, so the specific details of my memory are a bit fuzzy. The first thing I encountered was the control scheme. I really struggled with Crowsworn's controls. I think there are 2 reasons for this. One, the primary, if not only, major Metroidvania I've spent significant time with is Hollow Knight, as we discussed before, and 2, Crowsworn takes huge core stylistic influence from that title, so my brain just couldn't shed the muscle memory of Hollow Knight while playing. Fortunately, the game allows for pretty extensive controller remapping, so I ended up changing everything to basically as close to Hollow Knight controls as I could. But that definitely got things off on the wrong foot. Beyond this matter, the boss demo itself has plenty going for it, and a couple things that, at least as configured in the demo, could use some touching up. The main thing itself is that the boss is tough. For a first impression on the combat system, it was a lot to get to grips with, even when I had the controls in a more familiar place. There are two cases that can be made in regards to this philosophy. One, having too easy an enemy for said first impression, one that goes down too quickly or which does not encourage engaging in all the mechanics, would leave a very weird taste in the mouth, particularly when that fight is all the demo encompasses. Two, there is one degree which I feel like this may have been overtuned to a degree, the actual HP of the boss. So far as the first point is concerned, it is completely valid. I mean, it didn't take very long for some backers to get no-hit runs on the boss, but the skill ceiling with the combat model as it exists in this fleshed out form is still quite high. I'm by no means good at most games, the combat parts least of all, but the degree of elements to the player arsenal is already a lot to come to grips with. To learn all of that and the boss's mechanics and execute on everything takes a lot longer in that context than it otherwise might. I feel that if this exact boss fight appears in the full game, that it will go much easier inherently on account of the sheer number of hours and gradual accumulation of skills that Metroidvanias rely on. The skill ceiling is high, and I respect that. But I'd also argue the skill floor is perhaps a tad higher than necessary for the first impression, at least for me. Call me a pussy or a bad gamer, and one or the other or both may or may not be true, but it was a lot to tackle for me. But I think the nail in the coffin for my enjoyment of the boss fight as a whole comes down to HP. This guy simply has too much of it. Even the most efficient and perfect runs of the fight I've seen online take an entire minute to do. When utilizing all the skills and reading everything flawlessly still takes that long for what can't be more than a mid-game boss at maximum, it just seems a bit much to me. And again, the HP argument could boil down to the context of the demo too. After all, if the boss goes down too quickly, then there's nothing to really put teeth into. It also raises the skill ceiling that much more to require endurance, not just execution of a short sequence of button presses. Yet, I just feel like it's too much. In my time with the demo, about an hour and a half if I'm not mistaken, I had 3 successful runs. 3 total. The first one, surprisingly, didn't take that long. Then I got another one before too long after that. I spent an hour after that trying to perfect the boss, foolishly, and while I halfway succeeded, in that I got a no-heal run out of it, it took an entire hour to do so, without a single successful attempt in between the second and third victory. Even the no-heal run I executed flawlessly for 45 seconds before taking a hit, then another minute before taking another, and still another 20 seconds beyond that to complete. Something tells me if the HP here was about 80% of its current level, maybe even 85%, I'd be much happier as a generality. The fight just seems to last too long. Maybe my scaling for boss fights in these games is off, but I don't feel like I remember many single enemy Hollow Knight bosses lasting over 2 minutes with near perfect and non-passive execution. Like I said, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it's all intentional on account of this being a demo, but I just feel like the balance is off. The boss's telegraphs are well done and executable, and executing is rewarding just as it should be. I just suck at games, so maybe I'm making a bigger stink of it than everybody else is. That said, I think I've spent more than enough time on the boss demo. What about the vertical slice? While it took me an entire year to get to the boss demo after it was originally sent out to backers, it took me, I believe, a year and a half after the full demo was sent out to circle back around to it, much to my shame, chagrin, and disappointment. But when I finally got around to it, I had a great experience, mostly. We'll get to that. And mind you, be warned, I'm going to be pretty heavily critiquing a lot of the demo here. Just know that I still enjoyed myself. To begin, I really love the idea of making an entirely unique vertical slice as the playable demo for the game, rather than it being a random arbitrarily chosen section of the game. I know there are some backers who were probably relatively unhappy with this decision, given that it inevitably takes extra time to actually design and polish this world layout, and everything that comes with it, of course, made worse by the fact that this rendering of the world will not appear in the final game. I get it, it could very well leave a bad taste in the mouth, but I like this decision because it allows for a better control of balance within the slice, rather than see a small portion of the start of the game before any actual mechanics are introduced, or gating you to a particular early to mid-game area with all the tools that are accessible at this point. You get to see the start of the journey and the approximate degree to which that challenge and whatever else increases. It really was very cool. The introduction of the game was very familiar, and the environmental progression was familiar, and the start of the Metroidvania-isms was nice to experience firsthand. I like knowing that I'm not going to already know how the first couple hours of the proper game release will go exactly. But speaking on progression, the power progression does feel just a tiny bit weird to me. Of course, part of this is just inherent to the demo due to its scaling from introduction to somewhere in the early to middle of mid-game power, as per the word of Mongoose Rodeo. That, in just a couple of hours, is going to inherently be a more active progression than the final game will feature, by a long shot for sure. I can imagine that the power progression pacing of Hollow Knight isn't actually a bad way to anticipate the scale of this thing. So, saying that, why does the progression feel weird to me, even considering this fact? Well, I think it comes down to the disparity of power based on how much you accomplish. There are only 2 bosses in the demo. I would have expected 3 for this size of slice, especially given where the first boss is in the environmental progression. But while this is not in itself an inherent problem, it does mean that the difficulty difference between the two is immense. Ultimately, most of the progression-related criticisms I have with the demo are as a result of this particular problem. From the time between the first boss and the second boss is damn near the entire available content of the demo as a whole. Now, you can go anywhere from obtaining virtually none of that before facing the boss, all the way to getting all of it, of course, but this sheer degree of quote-unquote freedom for such a small slice of game with the degree of difficulty scaling it features doesn't ultimately work in my view. If you don't have all the upgrades, and not even none of them, mind you, you could have like half or 2/3 of them even. The second boss is incredibly difficult. Of course, your mileage may vary on this front, but given how obtuse it is to get some of these things, it is crazy how difficult this ultimately ends up being. The exacerbated difference between early game math and mid game math is evidently not the smoothest it could be, and it feels bad if you don't go for everything. But on the other hand, if you do get everything and go for the 100% ahead of facing the second boss, it's actually shockingly easy. I went from like a half hour of wasted effort in my first run of the demo, we'll go over that later, to first trying the boss once I had everything. That honestly felt pretty miserable. Then to rub salt in that wound, in my second run, when I had 100% before I fought this thing at all, I only died once. So what's the problem? Well, obviously the number and scaling is a little wonky on account of the size of the vertical slice, and on account of how much of the power progression it tries to show you in that short time. So fair enough. But I also just think the Metroidvania design philosophies as showcased in this particular demo are, well, they're messy. The primary problem I will talk about is the way that hidden areas and similar are utilized. They're not very effective or intuitive depending on the case. Let me give you some examples. 1. There are floors to blast through here, which is not unique, but the effect was too subtle for me to notice the first time playing. Even when I knew where the floor was, the second time, I had to search a few seconds to actually locate it. 2. There's an invisible wall in the second major area that conceals a mithril ore, an upgrade item, that I discovered purely by accident because I didn't necessarily have any reason to believe it wasn't meant to be discovered accidentally. For a secret and ultimately optional-ish area, this kind of design feels more reasonable, but for one singular upgrade item, this isn't the most exciting thing to experience. Now, I know these couple of examples seem pretty nitpicky, and they sort of are, but there are 2 others that are actually relatively major in my opinion, plus another non-hidden area example. We'll get there in a second. 3. Above the arena of the first boss is a hidden area that features this little bungalow of sorts and a grafting item to obtain. Again, we'll talk about grafting a little bit later. How in the hell is anybody supposed to guess this is up here? Sure, you gain the ability to wall climb here, but the jump you have to make at the top of the wall is finicky enough that I don't think anybody besides veteran Metroidvania players would have bothered trying to get over here at all. Anyway, the item obtained here is an item that you have to use at the very end of the demo, at this random bell that just kind of exists, to gain what will ultimately be your final health shard. You have to jump while wearing the item and let the shockwave, ring the bell or something. Forget the problem of obtusity in how anybody is supposed to intuit that this is the purpose of the item or the bell room. Considering the level of upgrade involved here, I'd imagine the degree to which the place the leg can be found is hidden isn't precisely fair. It recalls, albeit in a much less enthusing manner, the problem with the hidden mithril ore discussed in point 2.4. The worst example, however, has to be the smith, Brocker. I do not sincerely believe anybody discovered this guy except by accident or by looking it up like I did. How in the actual hell is anybody supposed to guess this guy is up here of all places? Without finding this guy and getting the 1 or 2 upgrades he provides makes the second/final boss of the demo nigh on impossible, for me anyway, and there's no indication that he's up here at all unless you do happen to stumble upon it accidentally by jumping around everywhere? You'd assume maybe you could hear him hammering away as an indication of his whereabouts, not unlike Cornifer the cartographer in Hollow Knight humming and leaving a paper trail, but I didn't experience this. I seriously have no idea how the hell something so vital is so unclearly hidden. 5. This point is less about hidden areas and more to build on the third point's problem of obtuse quest design, namely the Face of Splendor being used at the statue. It gives a clue about patience, and so I wait with the dialog box open. It does nothing. So I close the dialog box and wait. Still nothing. Staring down at the ground is what gives you the item from the statue. Why? Who the fuck knows? Why would I assume that I must look down while doing nothing as opposed to just, doing nothing like the note told me to do? I don't know, it just doesn't make sense to me. Most of the puzzles of this like in Crowsworn's demo just don't make sense to me. It's super unfortunate that major aspects of the Metroidvania design philosophy is such that it felt actively unfun to figure out what the fuck to do in such a narrow portion of game. Yet none of this even mentions the other problem with the Crowsworn demo's level design problem. The backtracking is freaking awful. I'd argue that the general level design of the demo is engaging and interesting to work through as a general matter. But if you're trying to get all of the things, and I'd further argue you more or less have to if you want to not suffer at the ending boss fight, it is absolutely miserable going back and forth and back and forth and back and fucking forth. It is actually absurd. I'd say that of the 1.5 hour Let's Play I posted of the demo, my second playthrough of it, Probably at least 20 minutes of that is just backtracking to fulfill the implicit quests of the world. It feels like padding to the demo rather than anything organic. Obviously, this kind of thing is nothing new for Metroidvanias, but most of those only waste this much of your time if that backtracking involves, a map several times the size, and in those cases, there are almost always other things to do along the way, or fast travel points to unlock that ease the burden. The vertical slice of Crowsworn doesn't bother with fast travel, likely because it's fairly small, but there's not any interconnectivity either, like shortcuts, to reduce the problem instead. So you were not infrequently going literally from one end of the world to the other on a constant basis just to fulfill basic needs. It gets super old, especially by the time you're at the end of the demo. And mind you, as a little aside, there are sort of mini shortcuts in a couple of the bigger areas so that you don't have to go through that entire section again, but the amount of time that this actually saves in the long run isn't very much considering how much time you're wasting by backtracking inherently. This is no small part of why my first run of the demo was something like 4 to 4.5 hours, plus an extra hour or so just trying to Google a very limited sample set of the internet, limited obviously by Kickstarter status, where the shit I missed even was at. In the end, I just found the actual Metroidvania elements of the game to be extraordinarily messy, and considering that that's a big part of the experience, I can only hope that QA and more time keeps the final product from being as frustrating as I found the demo to be a lot of the time. But my experience with the Crowsworn vertical slice backer demo wasn't all bad, of course. In fact, there are plenty of things I really liked. First of all, I really enjoyed the game mechanics that kept it fresh compared to other similar games. For example, the crafting menu is pretty interesting. It in and of itself isn't super unique per se, as it can very easily be related to the charm system in Hollow Knight as one particular comparison. However, the dynamic that I see this having in the final game is super fun to consider. Instead of just having generic charms that you can apply however you want, albeit contained to your notch count, in Crowsworn you actually have limitations of the types of grafts you can apply. 1 head, 1 torso, 2 arms, 2 legs. This means that the way you mix and match what you use beyond how many notches you have could make for some really interesting builds depending on how the balance is executed. In addition, you can technically over-encumber yourself in this game if you want for your build. Each notch over your encumbrance reduces your health by 1 point. That's a cool idea, and a way to balance challenge runs in a fun way too. As is, I don't love being limited to 4 notches in this demo. Being able to upgrade to 5 or something like that would have been nice, but I get it. The point is that I still really enjoy considering the possibilities with this menu. I like the way that healing and malice both work in this game too. Healing isn't as diegetic as, say, Soul in Hollow Knight is, but I appreciate the rather explicit count of how long you have to wait before your flask is ready to be used again, how many hits on enemies you have to make for that to work. Perhaps the devs could integrate this mechanic in a more intriguing in-world way in the final product, but I am glad for the mechanic nonetheless. But the malice gauge is also pretty cool. You have what are called Corvian powers, which feel familiar to the soul-powered attacks in Hollow Knight. And these Corvian powers utilize malice, which is another gauge that is filled by attacking enemies. And eventually, you can get an upgrade that allows for over malice. As long as you don't take damage, you have the ability to fill the malice meter a second time for even greater effect. I can't remember if you get a specific OP attack or version of your other attacks once you reach complete over malice, largely because I'm not good enough to have been able to really test it, but I imagine there's some fun and interesting possibilities for what to do with this in the full game as well. Furthermore, although this particular demo doesn't have the guns in it, they add a truly unique dynamic to the gameplay I'm looking forward to seeing. At least I'm pretty sure this demo didn't feature them. I swear to God, I can't be misremembering this, right? I know at least the first demo did. Finally, I also see a lot of potential in the boss design from this demo as well. The first boss is really good, and relatively challenging for a first boss, and I really enjoyed its depth and variety of attacks. The second boss is also very good outside of the ads it shoots out, simply moving too quickly and being inherently unavoidable if you get bad bounce RNG. Seriously, it is simply impossible to actively avoid these things. You kind of just have to get lucky with them and also hope the boss kills them for you, because you are going to have a real bad time if it doesn't. That one design choice notwithstanding, and the balance of the second boss being rough depending on what you've gotten done by then, I enjoy these fights mechanically. On to the topic of animation, I just want to say I really enjoy the animation design of the game based on this demo. I already spoke early in the video about how the visual design and tone is something I'm super into, but I also just like the way things look in action. Not everything feels as snappy as I would optimally like, but I have to remind myself that certain things can be adjusted, whether by the devs or even just in my mind, getting used to it. That said, I do have a few animation critiques. 1. The airborne animation of the player is a bit too floaty. It's weirdly really difficult to anticipate the arc of your movement, or at least I felt so. This was made most obvious in situations of pogoing off enemies or spikes or the environment, where the arc of the character's float and the hitbox of your scythe just feels kinda off sometimes. I can't precisely put my finger on why, but things frequently felt strange. 2. The recovery animation from being hit feels too long compared to the pace of most enemies' attacks, and this translates to a broader problem I noticed with certain animations just feeling too slow for the actual game's pace. Even the dodge roll animation comes off as too floaty, for lack of a better term, so that iframes don't always measure to what they intuitively should, or what they feel like they should. 3. Very many enemies have attacks or evasion animations that, again, just don't fit in time with the player character, or so it seems to me. Just too many movements and animations that feel just a matter of frames off, if that makes sense. 4. The animation and sound effects of hitting walls that aren't breakable could use a little extra feedback, since as is, they don't really feel like you're hitting a wall compared to something that might be breakable. Just a little adjustment could go a long way here. 5. A random QTE to random certain types of chests is incredibly random, and I'm not sure why these exist. 6. Although I saw somebody else on YouTube, shout out to Relia, moving the map independently of their character when he played, when looking at it, I could not seem to get that to work for me, so I was stuck just looking at a very small portion of it at any given point in time, depending on where I was. I don't know if it's because I'm just stupid or if something with my particular controller was affecting it, but it didn't feel right. Most of these are not really deal breakers unless they happen to be egregious or repetitiously irritating in the final product. Oh, and one final thing on NPCs, since I haven't talked about those up to this point. I don't really have any strong opinions one way or the other so far, based on such a limited sample. I like the Keeper, who I kept calling the Herald in my Let's Play for some reason, particularly from a visual design perspective, and I also guess I like the one shopkeeper, but the blacksmith I don't really have anything to say about one way or the other, and that's all on the NPC front. But by this point in the video, I have a hard time even really knowing / remembering what thesis I've been making here. But I guess all of it does kind of culminate in the way I actually think about my broader experience with the vertical slice demo, something that I've been more or less skirting around this whole time. My first run was not fun in the long run. In contrast, the second run was really enjoyable, although largely because I got lucky a couple of times and because I already knew quite freshly where everything was, as a result of literally recording my second attempt at the Let's Play immediately after finishing the first recording. What it comes down to is the fact that Crowsworn looks like it could be pretty messy, at least based on these admittedly limited demos. Each demo has some issues that I'm personally a bit worried about, but in both cases, I can also acknowledge and see that the biggest issues are, at least in part, and potentially entirely, on account of their being in their current demo states. But that doesn't keep me from being worried. Yet, I'm also excited too. I would not call Crowsworn a Hollow Knight clone, no matter the comparisons and obvious inspiration that can be seen from either end here, but I am hoping that Crowsworn manages to have an impact on me the way Hollow Knight did for so many, including me to a degree. In that way, I suppose I'm hoping for Crowsworn to leave a more lasting impression, a more lasting positive impression than the demos did. I enjoyed playing the demos, but I've also found myself wanting on account of them both. The visual design is great, there's a ton of potential with various systems, and overall execution looks like it'll at least be good, but I'm really just hoping for this thing to be certifiably great. And I'm also looking forward to making an impact on the world to some degree by contributing a poem to a library that my tier of the Kickstarter gets to do. Fingers crossed that email comes sooner rather than later, and especially that the game itself comes within the next year, or at least by the end of 2026. It's been a long wait, and there's certainly some jank, but I am ultimately looking forward to Crowsworn.